Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program here at the Harwood Museum of Art. I'm Nicole Dial-Kay, Curator of Exhibitions and Collections, and it's an absolute honor to have you all with us as we continue our exploration of the life and work of the remarkable artist Luchita Hurtado. Before we begin, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to our generous sponsors. Without their support, none of this would be possible. A heartfelt thank you to Anonymous, the National Endowment for the Arts, Hauser & Wirth, 203 Fine Art, Sherry Livney and Steve Hanks, Charles Hill, Kay and Thomas Tynan, Aaron Payne Fine Art, Debbie Vincent and Chocola, Dora and Carl Dillistone, Ms. Bornstein, Happy Price, Barbara Zarin, Lori Medley and Randall Johnson, and Rami and Carl Colonius. Your contributions have made this program and our exhibition a reality. Tonight's program accompanies our ongoing exhibition, Luchita Hurtado, Earth and Sky Interjected, which is a celebration of Hurtado's profound connection to New Mexico, the land that inspired much of her work and of her extraordinary artistic career that spanned over 8 decades. This exhibition brings together works that Hurtado created during her time here in New Mexico, pieces that speak to her intimate meditations on nature, as well as her most well-known works that have been praised by an international art world. While many of her works reflect her time spent in Taos, drawing inspiration from the vast landscapes and her intimate connection to the environment, her best-known series, like the I Am and Skyscan series, explore universal themes of identity and the interconnectedness of the human body with the natural world. These works speak not only to her unique artistic vision, but also to her profound commitment to addressing ecological concerns, often blurring the line between the self and the environment. It is in this context of exploring the intimate connections as humans that tonight's speaker, Dr. Laura Pérez, becomes especially relevant. Dr. Pérez is an esteemed scholar and a leading voice in the study of Chicanx, Latinx, and indigenous art, spirituality, and decolonial theory. She's written extensively on the politics of spirituality, aesthetics, and how art speaks to both personal and communal identities, making her the perfect person to further our understanding of Luchita Hurtado's work. Dr. Pérez is the author of several influential books, including Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities, Eros Ideologies, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial, and Consuelo Jimenez Underwood, Art Weaving Vision, which have earned her numerous accolades, including the College Art Association's Wyeth Foundation for American Art Publishing grant. She has curated major exhibitions such as Chicana Batgirls, Las Hociconas, and Amalia Mesa Baines, Archaeology of Memory, and currently serves as professor in Chicanx, Latinx, and Ethnic Studies, and chair of the Latinx Research Center at UC Berkeley. With a Ph.D. from Harvard University and a BA/MA from the University of Chicago, Dr. Pérez brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to tonight's discussion. Her work centers on the intersection of art, identity, and spirituality, themes that resonate deeply with Luchita Hurtado's practice. We are incredibly fortunate to have her here with us this evening. Dr. Pérez will speak for approximately 30 minutes, after which we will open the floor for a Q&A session. Following the program, the downstairs galleries, including Luchita Hurtado, Earth and Sky Interjected, will be open for 30 minutes. I encourage you to take this time to explore the exhibition, reflect on Hurtado's work, and perhaps see it in a new light after tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Pérez to the stage.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Thank you for joining us. Luchita Hurtado viewed Taos as a very special space because of its powerful energy, the imposing beauty of sky and mountain ranges, the living and ancestral presence of indigenous people and their cultures, and as an artistic mecca that drew many lifelong friends. The exhibition here at the Harwood Museum is aptly named Luchita Hurtado, Earth and Sky Interjected, because living in Taos seems to have allowed her to deepen the poetic and spiritual perception that we and all are interconnected. Most of Hurtado's work was produced after she and her family began visiting Taos, and after they built a home here in the early 70s, where they spent months of every year for decades. With that said, I would like to acknowledge and thank the ancestors and the Pueblo peoples indigenous to this place, and express gratitude for their survivance and the preservation of traditional knowledges about how to live more respectfully with the natural world, with each other, and in our own skins. Thank you also to Marie Heilig and Cole Root of the estate of Luchita Hurtado and Lee Mulligan, Nicole Dial-Kay, Gwen Fernandez, and Hannah Clofield of the Harwood Museum of Art, and Christina Carey of Howard Worth for the invitation and arrangements to join in tonight. Luchita Hurtado, born Luisa Amelia Garcia Rodriguez on November 28, 1920 in Venezuela, died on August 13, 2020 in Santa Monica, California. Because Tuesday marked the 4th anniversary of her death, I would like to dedicate these reflections about her work to her as a commemorative ofrenda. I first heard of Luchita Hurtado while curating the exhibition of another belatedly discovered U.S. Latina artist, Amalia Mesa Baines, who after 50 years of making art was to have her first retrospective at the age of 79 last year. That show is still traveling, I'm happy to say. As we were working on that exhibition, we wondered how Amalia might be received in the mainstream. And someone in the group mentioned Luchita Hurtado and the New York Times article that appeared in 2019, and a trend of the rediscovery of older women artists. Shortly after this, I was able to see Hurtado's first and only site-specific commission, I Live Here, an immense 25-foot by 63-foot black and white mural composed of 9 hand-drawn lines and 7 words. So this is an image of the drawing that was then blown up and reproduced on the art wall at the Berkeley Art Museum. You can Google it and see how it looked, in sight. It was part of the New Time, Art and Feminisms in the 21st Century exhibition that opened in August of 2021 there. Then the museum asked me to help organize a panel of living U.S. Latina California artists to discuss Hurtado's work while the mural was up, with Marie Heilig of the Mulligan and Hurtado estate. I invited 2 painters, Irena Cervantes from Los Angeles and Celia Herrera Rodriguez from the San Francisco Bay Area, and we began thinking about Hurtado's work together. I think that we were kind of shocked that we did not know of her, though she lived in California since the late 40s. And we were also saddened that Hurtado's powerful work had received only minimal attention and had been rediscovered only accidentally in the last decade of her life, when she was 95. She lived to be 99, just short 3 months of 100, so she really enjoyed that last period of her career and her life. How is this possible, given her marriages to the painters Wolfgang Paulin and Lee Mulligan, who actively produced and exhibited their work while married to Hurtado? Irena and Celia, artists who work extensively with Mesoamerican and U.S. indigenous cosmologies and art histories, worried about Hurtado's lifelong practice of collecting and selling indigenous artifacts. Did she romanticize or appropriate indigenous culture? How did she regard living indigenous peoples and their cultures? These are important questions that Tanya Barson has written about thoughtfully and which remain to be further studied. For my part, I wondered what it might have meant for Hurtado to be a Latina rather than a Latin American artist, one born in Venezuela but raised in New York City after immigrating at the age of 8 in 1928. She came of age as a young woman during the late 1930s and 40s without the benefit of the civil rights era, and remained close to her familial culture. Her mother and 2 aunts had migrated to the US temporarily. Hurtado had volunteered at New York City's oldest Spanish language newspaper, La Prensa. Her first husband was Latin American, and her second was fluent in Spanish and lived in Mexico City. She herself lived more than a year in Mexico City and Chile each, and months in Venezuela, and she remained bilingual her entire life, and some of her work paintings, as well as her last environmental paintings, were in Spanish. In letters of the 1940s, an artist's statement of the 70s, and in numerous interviews while she was in her 90s, Hurtado described herself as quote-unquote very dark. Her circa 1968 untitled self-portrait, in that self-portrait, she painted her reflection in a hand mirror and to the background all in shades of brown. An anecdote that Hurtado returned to in her writing of the late 70s and interviews during the decade of her death, she recounted a childhood memory that took place in Venezuela that, quote, gave her a lifelong aversion to a certain shade of pink, end of quote, because every year the priest in Venezuela would assign pink wings to the dark-skinned children in the hopes of lightening them up for the Easter service, but white wings went only to those who were fair. So understandably, she couldn't stand that shade of pink. In the late 1940s, she wrote to Wolfgang Pollen, who was her husband at the time, about her easily tanned, dark skin, and she shared that as a child, her mother had told her to stay out of the sun unless she wanted to be blacker than she already was. Elsewhere, she recounted being stopped by people in the US as she was growing up and throughout her life, asking whether she was Italian or a foreigner. And then she wrote that when she traveled in Spain, she finally felt a real sense of belonging when the local people told her that she was one of them. And she felt that way here in Taos when she attended indigenous ceremonies and she was asked to which tribe she belonged. Given what it is still like today, what must racism and colorism have been like for her? How did she manage it? Did it impact her artwork? Did moving in international artist circles largely shield her as Mrs. Louise Pollen or Mrs. Luchita Mulligan, while Mexican Americans pigmented like her were discriminated against and segregated with blacks and Indians in Texas, as she recounted to one interviewer? Why is she sometimes misidentified today, as is Cuban American Ana Mendieta, as a Latin American artist rather than the Venezuelan-born Latina or American artist that she was? To be a US Latina meant that she lived in a society of systemic gendered racism and social, economic, and cultural discrimination. Had she been a Latin American, it would have meant that she was dominant cultural herself, rather than a negatively racialized minority marginalized within society, as US Latinas and Latinos largely were. Hurtado was, of course, not impervious to the reality of racism, nor were her contemporaries that I could call in today's language people of color. Her lifelong dear friend, the Japanese-American sculptor Isamu Noguchi, had bitterly experienced the Japanese internment camp experience as a shaming and disempowering one, an experience far different than what he had thought and what he had been led to believe would be possible as a so-called volunteer leading creative work and art classes among the interned Japanese-American community during World War II. The racism and discrimination of the US at that time was denounced as hateful by art world contemporaries who crossed the US-Mexico borders, and by Luchita in retrospect, as she recalled the discrimination in Texas. I also wondered, in a different vein, if Hurtado had known Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, Frida Kahlo, and other women artists who were only a little bit older than she and who had been influenced by and influenced surrealism and lived in Mexico City during the time that Hurtado and Pollen did in the late 1940s. Had she shared and been shaped by similar sensibilities? If so, how, over the long trajectory of her work, had her work developed from such starting points? Leonora Carrington was a British expatriate who lived in Mexico most of her life. She was born only 3 years before Hurtado, and like Hurtado, lived into her 90s. Throughout Carrington's long career, her painting and writing increasingly explored the powers of women and of elders as crones. In Carrington's work, the uncanny and the magical are seen as everyday exchanges of energy. Like Hurtado, Carrington was interested in the pre-Christian. In Carrington's case, that led her to study Celtic matriarchal cultures and female creator figures, such as the white goddess, and to picture related imagery in her work. This is the giantess, guardian of the egg. And this is crone flower, which Carrington did in 1987. Leonora Carrington, as many of you know, was absolutely gorgeous. She was ravishing, and so to me it's been so fascinating that because she lived a long time, that the way she chose to represent herself was, I would even say, precociously aging herself. You know, she really embraced the crone and witchy energy. Anyway, Remedios Varo was a close friend of Leonora Carrington's and a Spanish Civil War expatriate who lived in Mexico as well until her death, dying very young, I think at the age of 55. In her painting, she visualized the interdependence of life forms and objects through visible lines of moving, shooting, or circulating energy. This is Armonía, 1956, and this next one is Reslicitando, which is a neologism that's been translated into Still Life Revolving, which was her last painting in 1963. Hurtado, Carrington, and Varo regularly visited each other after Luchita married Wolfgang Pollen and moved to Mexico City in 1946, until 1949 when the couple relocated to San Francisco. Study of these three artists show that they shared abiding interest in a broader reality of circulating energies beyond the visible, in life as mystery, in seemingly magical powers of humans and nature, in the human as interdependent with other life forms, and in the ability of women to connect to the power of nature despite being marginalized under patriarchal cultures. In Luchita Hurtado, the identification with a vibrant, living planet would lead her toward the end of her life to identify as a planetarian, and to numerous untitled environmental works. In 2018, in one series, she painted the words air, water, fire, earth, and in Spanish, aire, agua, mundo, fuego. In another of these environmental works, worms tilled, she painted, worms tilled the hard soil of our planet, parentheses, not Adam and Eve. And another one, she simply wrote, no place to hide. Paintings of trees with human figures juxtaposed to them included this piece, they breathe out, we breathe in. And a series of birth paintings showed crowning infant heads rising from beneath brown parted legs, viewed from the mother's perspective. She subtitled one of these untitled paintings, parentheses, Birthing Mother Earth. Hurtado explained at the time, we're all on this planet together and we're all related. Our closest relative is a tree because they breathe out and we breathe in. In 1928, Hurtado's star was reaching its zenith. With her newfound visibility, numerous interviewers probed why her work was not better known while that of her husband's was. She had different responses in different interviews, and that also seemed to be addressing different times in her life. For example, quote, nobody ever knew I did any painting at all. I was someone else at the time, and I wasn't about to share with anyone. It was a part of me that wasn't asking to be recognized, end of quote. She also pointed out that she had had 4 children. 3 of these had been spaced every 11 years, so just when she finished with one, the cycle would start over, she pointed out. Life was full and busy, and being a mother and wife was very time-consuming. Her energies also went into supporting her husband's lives as artists, both of whom she greatly admired. When asked about Lee Mulligan, pressed actually, the feminist interviewer was pressing, she said, I was never resentful. I admired his work so much. What comes across in the many interviews of that last decade of her life was that she felt no regrets about her life or her career. Had she wanted to prioritize success as a painter, she would have achieved it, she stated in one interview. Another interviewer said, well, you were always known as Lee Mulligan's wife. But, she replied, I always knew I was an artist, and that's what really mattered. Visible or not as an artist, she made clear that she felt the need to paint and draw throughout her life. And while she characterized the periods when she did little artwork as her darkest, when she felt she'd lost herself, She also said that in the end, she had found herself. But did she ever feel differently about showing her work? In 1942, Hurtado made what is considered her first painting, and by 1943 had discovered an ink and crayon technique and had developed a totemic imagery and abstract figures of small-headed figures in motion, sometimes described as dancing. In what was probably 1949, what I'm showing right now is a 1945 untitled piece, and this is a 1947 piece. So in what was probably 1949, when she was stranded in New York City without a passport at a friend's house, she wrote her husband, Wolfgang Paulin, that she had spent the whole day painting and asked for his opinion about her work. Quote, "But paint I must, no matter how many pyramids I must make with my baggage in order to do so. Needless to say, I'm most curious to hear what you have to say about the work I'm doing when you see it." End of quote. Paulin was 15 years Hurtado's senior. Remember, she's in her 20s, born in 1920. He was well known in expatriate artistic circles, well connected, and respected as both an artist and an intellectual. Hurtado remembered him throughout her long life as an extraordinary man with whom she was very much in love and who had been a teacher to her. In another letter, she asked his advice on showing her artwork to René Darnoncourt, an art curator also born in Vienna, like Paulin, and director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City from 1949 to 1967. Quote, "Should I or should I not show him the things I've been working on? Knowing myself and how I behave, I could almost bet that I do not show the paintings. We'll probably put it off for a later date. René has asked several times to see my work." End of quote. Darnoncourt's support of Mrs. Louise or Luchita Palin, then in her late 20s, would have been tremendous. At that time, the women in surrealist circles, quote, "didn't feel equal to men," end of quote. This is from Hurtado in an oral interview of 2001 before she became very well known. Quote, "I was always treading very gently, you know. I was aware of things that happened around me, and I didn't want to make difficulties for Paulin either, you know. It was a very difficult thing to cope with sometimes," end of quote. Nonetheless, the years with Paulin were clearly formative for Hurtado. He was still producing the influential post-surrealist magazine Dyn, D-Y-N, which had been founded in 1940. Paulin and a small circle around him thought of their project as moving beyond the surreal towards an artwork that conveyed glimpses of, quote-unquote, the possible, which was the Greek root of the word dynaton. As the central theorist of the magazine and organizer of the San Francisco exhibition, which was called Dynaton, Paulin recognized the power of Cubism and Surrealism in their earliest manifestations, but now he theorized the need to abandon known subjects or, quote, entities pre-existent to the picture, end of quote. Abandoning anthropomorphic concepts, he wrote, was a necessity that would allow grasping the newest, as yet unexpressed experiences of the present reality in the act itself of art making. But Paulin didn't mean the celebration of new objects and technologies as with futurism, because, quote, art only exists insofar as it can express cosmic sensations in terms of human emotions, end of quote. Neither was he promoting ideological dogmas or religious aesthetic formulas. Instead, he argued, quote, the artist of our time can be authentic only when he creates new modes of seeing, only when he is original. Everything that opens the way for new possibilities of experience is revolutionary, end of quote. So as I've said, though Hurtado did not publish in Dyn or actually exhibit with Dynaton, she shared with Paulin and many other inter- and post-World War artists an interest in the unseen energies animating life. It drew them and Hurtado's third husband, Lee Mulliken, into lifelong interest in African, Polynesian, pre-Columbian, and living traditional indigenous cultures, and to other non-Christian and pre-Christian cosmologies, as well as to shamanism, magic, and paranormal phenomena, but not as superstition, but rather as unyet explained but experienced dimensions of reality and human capacity. Many artists of that era reacted against the social, cultural, religious, and economic reality of the European societies which had birthed the catastrophic World War I and World War II. They sought a different logic, a different way of understanding life and reality. The irrational, the oniric, the new science of psychology's automatic associations were techniques that surrealists, for example, cultivated in the hope of moving beyond normative values and perspectives. Non-European cultures seemed to offer to them evidence of cosmologies or worldviews which could be a new hope for a greater self-realization and a more humane social model to remedy the alienation, the social and economic exploitation, materialism, and the money-centered bourgeois values that industrialized modernity had created. Like many women who were part of the surrealist and post-surrealist circles of Europe, Mexico, and New York City, Hurtado did not consider herself either a surrealist or a member of Dynaton. As was true for so many of the women artists associated with male artists of the historical avant-garde, Hurtado's painting does not seem to have been championed or supported in any sustained way at that time. While in her 90s, Hurtado recalled that it was only after joining the Women's Collective of Artists in Los Angeles in 1971 that she stopped turning her paintings towards the wall, away from visitors. But when, I wonder, did she first start turning her paintings toward the wall? When did she stop trying to show her work? In an autobiographical statement excerpted in the feminist journal Heresies in 1979, she reflected, quote, "From the beginning, painting has been a most integral part of my life. I make clothes, I cook meals, I've raised children, I write poetry, and I keep a journal of my dreams as well as my days. But most important, I paint and consider myself a painter. An artist's recesses become a condition, a preparation to transmit, a commitment to oneself. It took me a long time, however, to think of myself as unique. But life is tentacled, and what I did with it sometimes suggested a loss of self. During whole years at a time when I stopped painting, I became particularly aware visually, and I wonder now if, like a person blinded, whose other senses become very acute to compensate for the loss of sight, if I did not open and use hidden levels of consciousness," end of quote. Hurtado ended that 7-page artist statement with feminist bravado, quote, "After all, settled and colonized, women have always seemed to hold their own, instinctively recognizing their true source, sensing their affinity to both mountain and leopard," end of quote. The title of today's talk, Luchita Hurtado, Anima, the Telluric, and her art, offers the concept of anima, the repressed self that Carl Jung, founder of analytic psychology, theorized as the shadow, a part of human consciousness that must be integrated into a healthy psyche or mind. Jung felt that the highly domesticated culture of modern Europe produced widespread neuroses, the dehumanization of others as if they were less than human, and ultimately wars. At the heart of the problem, he felt, were historically recent views, historically recent meaning just in the past recent centuries, historically recent views that over-valorize materialism and a simplistic yet dominant empiricism that discounted too easily what couldn't yet be measured or classified. Further, an idea of civilization that repressed natural instincts split humans from their animal selves, he thought. The solution, he argued, lay in rebalancing human behavior through the rediscovery and the reintegration of what is natural and unique to each of us as individuals. For Jung, it was instinctive animal nature that had been thrust into the shadows and which must be recuperated from our individual and culturally collective underworlds. Without a hero or heroine's journey to recuperate a greater, more complex awareness of self, Jung feared that we would continue to project onto others the parts of ourselves that we had been taught to fear, and which now existed within us as repressed shadow selves, and this is what he called the Anima, or the animus. For Jungian feminist psychologist, writing many, many decades later, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, author of the 1990 Women Who Run with Wolves. For Pinkola Estes, under patriarchy, the shadow or the anima is the female and what is associated with women. Genuine psychological well-being for women must therefore involve the recuperation of women's intuitions and instincts, their perspectives, and their own reason for being, apart from the subservient roles assigned to them under cultures like our own that continue to center female energies around male perspectives and desires. In short, for women in patriarchal cultures, the shadow is the undomesticated female self. It's striking in the poetic passage quoted from Luchita Hurtado's undated artist statement from which I just read, published while she was in her late 50s on the cusp of 60, that she identifies with both mountain and leopard, recalling Leonora Carrington's precocious and fierce self-portrait in Of the Dawn Horse, where she painted herself with a hyena, a white horse, and as an unruly, frowning woman. In the late 60s and throughout the 70s, Hurtado made nude, downward-gazing self-portraits, her I Am series. This is an era when she realized that she was her body, indeed, that in a sense, all she had was her body. This reclamation was both new to that decade in general among feminist artists, but not easy, as visible in drawings like the Entitled piece that you're looking at now, which was also informally called The Judges, and Hurtado explained that that's how she felt. The I Am series included both clothed and unclothed foreshortened versions of the artist's body as viewed from above and excluding her head. She explained that she began the paintings in the closet of her home in Chile, while her third and last husband, Lee Mulliken, was on a year-long university exchange program. She'd also discovered in that time that her husband was having an affair. She explained that when she started the series, she felt pudor, or shame, painting her body nude. In a sense, the nudity of this self-portrait suggests a rebirth, an important coming of age and self-awareness and self-acceptance. The vertical I Am self-portraits would eventually be painted, as you can see in the gallery, or as you will soon see in the gallery, at nearly her own size. On some level, recording a visual affirmation of her brown female body and dimensions of her inner and outer selves hinted at by oversized fruit, small toys, plants, a cracked floor, and indigenous patterned rugs. Quote, "I have no one, I have only myself. This is all I am," she wrote. And she would paint herself in multiples, as you see here, hinting at inner dialogue and multiple viewpoints, indicating multidimensionality through the position of feet, a knee in motion, or a hand gesturing towards the other self. The corporeality of the vertical I Am nudes will be rendered as horizontal landscapes, and these in turn will give way to natural mountainous landscapes and then abstract natural landscapes in the Skyskin series. Hurtado's explorations of self and body as landscape are akin to contemporaneous, meaning in the 70s, feminist explorations by other women artists, such as Ana Mendieta, working in the landscape along riverbeds and caves or in the roots of trees. Mendieta's earth body works, as she called them, began by using her own body set within these settings, and then only her silhouette, and then using natural formations that appear as abstractions of her silhouette, like cave openings. In exploring her body in nature and then as nature, Mendieta displays negative socially inscribed identity markers that cast her as dark or foreign, as a woman of color. Instead, and by the way, this language is taken from things that Ana Mendieta wrote about how she was received in the US when she came as a child, as an exile from the Cuban Revolution. Instead, Mendieta presented herself contextualized within nature, as I've said, and in dialogue with ancestral pre-patriarchal indigenous and Afro-diasporic cultures, and finally, as part of the living, vibrant life force of the planet and cosmos in her later work. Like Mendieta's, Hurtado's nude self-portraits decenter a history of art that visually reflects male-centered, patriarchal perspectives, privilege, and power. In the work of both of these artists, Mendieta and Hurtado, their self-representations shift voyeuristic, male heterosexual, sexualizing perspectives into a broader erotic, an eros rooted in sensibility of the connection between all life forms. Framed within and as part of the landscape, these women artists under patriarchy stage their full humanity, regaining a largeness and a mystery that exceed social and cultural minimization in their gendering, and resist, as Hurtado put it, female colonization. Luchita Hurtado's self-portraits increasingly become universal figures which stand in not just for women, but for humans. Feet started it, Hurtado explained, then they became something else. Figures apart from me, then legs, whole bodies, bodies. But Telluric, in the subtitle of today's talk, references Hurtado's body as one that is of and relating to the earth, and more generally, evokes the animate nature of the earth as planet. The I Am paintings convey telluric animacy through the anthropomorphizing of the landscape, the suggestion through this technique that the planet is living akin to the human body. In the Sky Skin series, the brown body is now the earth itself. The outlines of the human body and the natural landscape are now both abstract, undulous lines rendered in skin and earth-colored browns. In these slightly strange paintings, 3 or 4 sides of the painting are framed with ambiguous, fleshy landscapes. One has the unsettling sensation of looking out and up from an improvised aperture in the sack of our own hides. Be that as it may, a sensation of disembodiment is created, and what predominates is an awareness of the sky and an almost unimpeded sense of oneness with the sky. This sensation is corroborated in a 2020 interview where Hurtado explains that the perspective, quote, is from the grave. You're in a hole and you're looking up at the sky, and that's the sky skin, end quote. Flesh returned as earth to earth and sky are interjected here. Yet consciousness remains, and the animacy of nature is marked by 1 or more feathers in free fall. The vitality of the seemingly impassive sky is symbolized by serendipitous faces or bodies that feathers momentarily reveal. Fleshy frames have dissolved into sky in pieces such as máscara, mask, and the umbilical cord of the earth is the moon. Hurtado's sun skins leave us with the sensation that nature's enigmatic codes are sometimes glimpsed. Her word paintings of that same decade, the 70s, worked the themes of life, death, and life beyond death in pieces like I live, I die, I will be reborn, where the blue of sky is now the primary palette against which she paints these words, only to cut them up and sew them in a barely decipherable order. Painting here is cipher. During the 70s, Hurtado also worked on white paintings, experimenting with mirror images of words such as yo, I am, Eve, and pairings such as Adam and Eve. In some of these works, words revolve around a Mandela-like white square, a white square that characterizes her Moth Light series, and that also appears in self-portraits through her shadow, or they revolve around circles and spirals, including circular clouds overlaid over her shadow and centered in the frame, or oval clouds between the body as landscape and landscape as sky, as in one of the pieces that is in the show that we've already seen. Breast landscape and earth landscape face each other with an ovoid cloud in between. Through her art, Luchita explored the self, the human, and the meaning of life on the planet for her. In her 90s, she concluded that life and death remained mysteries, but that life was an adventure, one to which she had always said yes. During 7 decades of art making, Hurtado explored many styles of painting, as you've seen, and more that you haven't seen, but one of the unifying threads across much of her work was this expression of the intimate connection of the human to a natural world understood as animated and interdependent. Her work from the late 60s on particularly captures the natural world as animated and the female brown body as intimately part of this greater whole, whether through self-representation, one of the moth-like pieces, whether through self-representation as natural landscape, or the dissolution of self into landscape, or landscape as animated, or through the painting of words, or in the work just prior to her death in 2020, Hurtado blurred the line between the self and surrounding world to awaken us to the reality of a planet of interdependent life forms where we are only one species among many. Thank you. So if there are any comments or questions or anecdotes, that would be amazing.
Share? Oh, I'm so sorry. It sounds like she was very isolated in the male art community, but did she have female peers who were artists?
Yeah, she did. She was really fortunate in that as she was growing up, so and already by the time she's 17, she's involved as a volunteer at the Spanish language newspaper where she met Latin American intellectuals, journalists, and artists. So at a very young age, for example, she's like talking about how to mix colors with an artist who's older than her and established, not famous everywhere, but established, which was the Mexican artist Rufino Tamayo. And I mean, anyone you can think of from that era that was famous, Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, she met. So there were a lot of women artists that were a part of that world. And the art histories that have been told, I think up until maybe 70s and 80s, when that first generation of feminist art historians start writing, we really had stories of the men. And people might say, I remember reading one art history from Mexico that mentions Frida Kahlo as the beautiful wife of Diego Rivera, who's also a painter. And so that kind of thing was happening all the time. Leonora Carrington was the young and beautiful lover of the much older Ernest. What was it?
Ernest Haas.
Who?
Haas.
Ernst? I cannot believe it.
Max Ernst.
Max Ernst. I wanted to start with Ernst. I was like, no, is that? Yeah, I mean, that's just like thank you, Grace. That's like a great example. So we're even seeing it right now. We're really seeing like shows that are happening. We're seeing scholarship that's coming out where kind of the attitude is like, oh, and the girlfriend or the lover or the wife was like an amazing artist as well. One of the things that I think is so interesting is that those women, in spite of not getting sort of the same kind of attention and support, that when they were asked, like, are you a surrealist? They're like, no, I'm not. Because they were part of that world, they were part of the conversations, the socializing, traveling together, but they had a different perspective. And I think that their gendering had a huge amount to do with it. They seem to, this is a big generalization, but on the basis of studying and reading about many of them, they seem to have been open to, because I think it was a power for them that they didn't otherwise have, to thinking about women / Mother Earth, generative power. It wasn't like sentimental, it was like, prehistoric and pre-Christian cultures honored mothers because, like the planet itself, the analogy was anything that can create, and so in those cultures, women weren't also simply seen as mothers. It was just one of the many things they did. So she was surrounded by women. In one of the interviews that I quoted from, where she's being prodded by the interviewer about like, didn't you feel left out? And she's like, yes, I did. We all did. That's what she said. We all did, and it was difficult for us because I think they also really supported these men that were also apparently very cool men, very open-minded and all of that. But, you know, they had put their career absolutely first, and these women were doing their thing, you know. So it's a really complex, I mean, I think it's too simplistic, and it doesn't really honor those women's strategies for survival, that they made art their whole lives. It's too simplistic to say that they were mainly and only catering or centering their life around men. However, in the cases where there's a big age group, a big age difference, like 15 or 20 years, you know, it's only natural that, you know, whether this is like a gay couple or, you know, whether it's a hetero couple, that there should be this kind of like a teacher relationship. I mean, inevitably, because you just know more things if you're older. So it's a super interesting question. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes.
It dawned on me during your lecture that Judy Chicago lives in New Mexico, and she was such a pivotal figure during the Women's House and with the dinner party. Do you have any commentary on that? Or I haven't had or heard any connection between them. And most of this work was done in the 70s, early 70s, when that was really happening in LA.
Right. Yeah, 1971, Women's House. My guess, and it's only a guess because I don't recall having read anything that mentioned Judy Chicago. She was not, for example, mentioned in the first circle of the women that are organizing from like 1971 to 74. I mean, I think my guess is that their paths would have crossed. And you know, I think the thing too, I mean, when I saw a big retrospective of Judy Chicago's about a year ago or so, at one of the museums in the Bay Area, and I was really surprised to see the kind of work that Judy Chicago was doing her whole life. Because some of us mainly know her through the dinner party, right? And there's just so much work that she did, it was fascinating. And so in that exhibition, I really felt like Judy Chicago's made it into our histories, largely through the dinner party, but we still don't really even know, in general, that much about Judy Chicago. That's how I felt when I saw the show. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks so much for bringing such nuance and complexity to Luchita and to. So weird to be on this side of it. To bring so much nuance and complexity to her life and to her story, and for complicating this narrative around, you know, women sort of existing in relationship and to the men in their lives. Like, I really appreciate that narrative that you brought. I'm curious as a scholar and a curator. You know, you talked about your show with Amalia Malsa-Baines, you know, Luchita's being rediscovered, Agnes Pelton, like this sort of nuance or this sort of tendency that we seem to have right now to like look back at women and find them late in life or even after they're dead. Like, do you have any thoughts on like why that is becoming sort of a trend of this moment? Is it like the fact that they're not present as much anymore? They're older women, like their power is a little more palatable. Like, what is? Just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I've thought about that, and you know, we haven't documented anything, but I get opinion. So I feel that the museums and scholarship is changing with every new generation. And so I feel like that, you know, people want to see, there are a lot of women, you know, and a lot of queer community who are in museums and for whom in their everyday life, you know, there is this diversity, and that's also true for ethnic or so-called racial diversity. And so, you know, we socialize, we live, we intermarry in a way that isn't yet fully like reflected in what we know to be U.S. or American art. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. Like, I intended to write about my own generation when I first started writing, when I saw that the generation before mine hadn't been well documented. I went, oops, I think I need to start there first, you know? And so most of what I've done has dedicated itself to that older generation, you know, because I didn't want to be a part of an art history that is very kind of developmentalist. That's like anything that happened before, except for a few exceptions, is obviously old and passé. And it's a way that isn't really fair to an artist themselves, because an artist is always growing and developing, right? And so, it makes sense to not trap an artist in the work that happened to make them famous. So I feel like that people like us are, wanting to see something else happen. And, in the anecdote that I told about, like when I first heard about Luchita Hurtado, the person who shared the anecdote of like, oh, I think it's going to go well for Amalia because, there's this trend right now of rediscovering older women. And then he named a few people, and he named Luchita. And then I heard other people talk about it in a way that is like almost embarrassed, like it's a trend and we're doing it because we should, but it's not like making an objective choice about who you want to show. And I think that's really flawed thinking. I feel like that, it's a trend that is so overdue that it wouldn't be a trend and we wouldn't need to do anything like that if we felt that before these people die, we can interview them and show their work and celebrate them. Men, in this casual way, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that male artists are really, really dedicated to their work and they're able to be showing and they dedicate themselves professionally. They have retrospectives even in their 40s, not 79, not 94 or 95. And so, I think it's still an issue, a patriarchal art world that is slowly shifting. So I'm really thrilled to be learning about all these amazing women. And I'm really happy to, in a small way, be part of it. And these conversations help us to rethink those narratives that we have of what should art history look like, what should the museum look like. I think we have to re-narrate curation in that way too. So we're not just hostage to my latest discovery, is 12 and very talented. That's cool too, but that doesn't mean that 80-year-olds shouldn't have a show. Thank you for that question. Yes?
You talked about Hurtado's focus and use of indigenous traditions and thank you. Her use of indigenous art forms and traditions as inspiration and as discovery and sort of points for her to move through her work. Do you know, or is it known, did she ever use an indigenous traditions from Venezuela, like the pottery Venezuela?
Oh.
Did she use any of, or look at any of those works, like the pottery pieces from the Canadian region or anywhere like that?
I don't know that. I know that I recently learned that when she was in Chile, I learned this reading an interview with Lee Mulliken, that when they were in Chile, that they actively went and visited different indigenous communities there. I don't know yet enough. I haven't seen the collection. I have read an inventory of the collection that's not detailed enough for me to read anything in it. That's a really, really, I think, important question as we continue to study her, because she did say in interviews that that she felt indigenous, and that her Venezuelan family, there were many people that looked like her, which means mixed, and various shades of skin, which she called dark. Sometimes she described herself as very dark. And she said, but none of them will identify with her indigenous culture. And when they were in Chile, Lee Mulliken talked about how it felt like being in a European city, because white identified, right, Latin Americans, and there were many, many German immigrants in Chile, as in other parts of Latin America at that time. They really did identify, or like in Argentina, a lot of Italian immigrants, they really did identify with their own, European, more direct tradition. So I think it means a lot that that Luchita cared about the indigenous, and that she was trying to somehow connect with ancestry without any direct connection. I think the question, the thorny and really important question of whether or not there was kind of a naive or romanticizing appropriation, that question remains, and I just don't know the answer to that. I did read an article that I mentioned by a curator, a really good article, that I thought was super careful and talked with detail about some of the images that she was using. For example, kachina, in one of her I am drawings, I look down, there's a basket, there's a kachina, and the author tells you exactly which kachina, right? So, don't know. Yes, please.
I wonder, I can bloviate unaided, but I wonder if her work would have been as personal if she had been more out-facing, because her work was very much, it seemed like, for herself, and her motive was not to show it to anybody or really to show it publicly. I wonder if it would have been as effective as it is now, because it's like somebody like Vivian Meyer, the photographer. One of the reasons why her self-portraits are so powerful is because she never had any intention of sharing them with anybody, and they were completely for herself. So I do wonder if, in the 40s or 50s, if she had received more recognition, if her later work in the 70s would have been nearly as powerful.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
She continued to make, so from the early 40s, mid 40s, from 44, she's making these really cool figures that are very modernist, they remind me of modernist sculpture, etc. And I think they could easily have hung in galleries with those shows. And she kept on doing them until the 60s, shortly before she starts doing the I Am series and most of what you saw today. And it starts becoming it looks more, there's more movement, it looks more like calligraphy. It's also super interesting work. But yeah, I think your question is really good. What does it mean when you can make work for yourself, in a really more unself-conscious way? Good question. Yeah. If there was another question here, then she would.
I think it's going to be our last question.
Well, I had the honor of meeting her in the late 90s and was in her house for, a short period of time. And besides all of her paintings and her own work, the house was filled with quite a few Native American artifacts. But to say that she felt she was appropriating Native American culture, I don't think so. She was a very gracious person. And I think she probably enjoyed these things for their aesthetic acumen and the quality of the craft of the art that she had collected, and probably also her husband Lee had collected. But that's a really tough question. She definitely never came across to me as a wannabe Indian.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
I think she was very much her own person.
Yeah.
She exuded confidence, and stature, and she would have been in her late 80s at this time.
I really appreciate that comment because I think it is clear that Hurtado really respected indigenous cultures, and all of those people, the surrealists who were also really interested, there was a connection to the ancestors in many objects. They felt that many objects had spirit and energy. And if you read about traditional African diasporic objects and indigenous objects, many are made with this kind of intention and the idea that the object is full of spirit, right? So I think they believed that, and I think they respected it. I do think that the question of appropriation is a little bit different. It has to do with whether or not sometimes those of us who are not, members of enrolled tribes, right, even be mixed indigenous, like so many Latinos and Latinx are. It has to do with the issue of whether or not sometimes we fall into romanticizing indigenous culture, and we fall into oh, they were so great, if we'd only, continued living in an equitable way with them, And then we forget that there are living communities with real issues, et cetera, today. So it's a much bigger question, but I'm very happy that you asked that because at least we can end with opening it. Because when scholars, and forget scholars, when indigenous peoples raise these questions, they're often coming from a place of like displacement. Like, I would like to be able to talk about my community's work, what we mean by it, and not have to have someone else who isn't an enrolled member lionizing our work or using it or censoring it. So it's also complex because there's good intentions and good work happens in the world through non-Indigenous people using those words, but then also it opens the door, an invitation to then how do we, coexist and share the museum and everything else with Indigenous people themselves. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much for coming. The galleries will be open for 30 more minutes, so you can come and talk to the brilliant Dr. Perez in the galleries directly. Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. Let's give her a huge round of applause.